All right, guys. Hopefully everybody doesn't have any issues hearing me whatsoever. But I'd love to welcome everybody today to the second Community of Practice session this year, focusing on universal design for learning. My name is Jordan Holohan. I am a third year PhD candidate in the Department of Archaeology here at Memorial University. I started my UDL journey by joining Amy's CARES Lab team in creating the COP that we now have launched. And I'm happy to say that I also use UDL in my coursework, in my teaching. Just one of the examples that I use UDL quite frequently now is in my presentation. I'm always making sure that I'm using the proper size font. So size 18, making sure that it's sans serif without like the hooks on the bottom. So I'm using Calibri a lot, and I'm making sure that I put those into my presentations quite frequently. I'm just going to give a little a territory acknowledgement and then introduction to Logan's presentation today. So we want to acknowledge the land on which we work, study, and live within eastern Newfoundland as situated in the territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq since time immemorial. We also want to acknowledge Labrador as the homeland of the Innu and the Inuit since time immemorial as well, a place where Innu and Inuit have and continue to maintain deep connection to the land, water, and the skies. We would also like to acknowledge the many urban Indigenous peoples living in Happy Valley Goose Bay, Labrador City, St. John's, Corner Brook, and other urban centers throughout the province. So Transport NL is a nonprofit organization that provides resources, tools, and support for trans, non-binary, intersex, gender diverse, and two-spirit people here in the province. Through their advocacy efforts, community building opportunities, and program offerings, they work to expand gender diversity awareness and inclusion in this province. From Transport NL today, we have Logan St, who's going to discuss creating learning spaces where trans, non-binary, gender diverse folk can feel safe and seen. Logan, if you'd like to take it away, you totally can.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Just want to check to make sure if everyone can hear me. We're using a outside audio. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jordan, on that. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. Patient, I'm not used to Teams. All right, can you all see that up there?
Yep, I can see that there, Logan.
Awesome, thanks, Jordan. So yeah, like was mentioned, I'm here with Transport NL. So we're a nonprofit organization. We're based here in St. John's, Newfoundland. My name is Logan St. Croix. I use he or they pronouns. And so a lot of our work throughout the province is raising awareness, doing advocacy, peer support, and community building activities for the transgender diverse community of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm going to bring us through this presentation. I do have a bit of time at the end for questions if we, wanted to have a bit of a discussion afterwards. But please also feel free to jump in onto the chat or unmute yourself if you can, just to kind of be part of the conversation as well. Getting us started. That change, yes, awesome. This is just like a little overview of what we're going to be doing over the next hour and a half. The first thing we're going to start talking about is just understanding gender as kind of like a concept. This is something that we do a lot when we're doing our Gender 101 trainings, just so we get all kind of like on the same page what we're talking about in terms of gender diversity. We're going to go into a little bit more specifically around gender diverse and trans identities, talk a little bit about the Newfoundland context here, where we situate across the rest of Canada in terms of our population here. Then I'm going to do a little bit of a case scenario. So I'm going to hope folks are feeling chatty today on this lovely Friday afternoon to come in and give us some ideas as we walk through a little case scenario, how we can start to use UDL in some of these practices to make spaces, particularly educational spaces, more welcoming and inviting for trans people. Then we'll talk a little bit quickly, about some of the UDL principles and some tips that you can kind of use to make your classroom, your space more inclusive as we're going. Like I said, at the end, we'll take some time for some reflection and questions. Please, feel comfortable to share as we're going through. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is gender? And maybe just give it like a little bit of a minute for people to try to think about what that is. What would you use if an alien came down to Earth and had no idea about what gender was, what it meant? How would you go about describing gender? It's something that's kind of like all around us, but maybe not something we all have to think about. Most of the time, it seems a little bit innate to a lot of us. How would you go about kind of describing that to someone else? The first thing that we want to think about as we're going through talking about gender is it's not the same as sex assigned at birth. So gender and sex are often confused or kind of used interchangeably. Yeah, an unexpectedly difficult question to answer. Yeah, it's something that seems so natural to us, right? But to kind of describe it and what it means and how we determine what it is, is something that is a little bit more kind of complex. So for the intents of our project, or of our presentation today, we're going to be talking about it in a few different ways. So like I said, the first thing being that it's not the same as sex assigned at birth. When we're born, we're all given a label, usually M or an F, by doctors, and this is by really looking at a baby's external genitals and determining what goes on to a birth certificate. This goes on to our legal documents, and it's often assumed to tell us everything about a person's body and identity, but we actually know that sex is much more complex than just what we can see at birth. So when we're talking about like what some people might call like again like biological sex, it actually includes a range of different traits, right? Like chromosomes, hormones, your internal reproductive organs, secondary sex characteristics. And those things don't always neatly match up to this kind of male or female binary, right? We also know that there are people who are intersex, meaning they're born with physical or genetic traits that don't fit the typical definitions or of male and female bodies. And intersex characteristics are just a natural variation of human biology. Some may be visible at birth, some show up during puberty, or some might never be kind of like externally apparent at all. Intersex people have always existed across cultures, across time. Gender, on the other hand, is more about the sense of who we are, how we see ourselves, and how we express ourselves to the world, and how we relate to the roles and expectations that are placed upon us. It's shaped by culture, identity, experience, not just our bodies. And so while many people grow up identifying with the gender that match their assigned sex, many others do not. And that's why it's so important to understand that gender and sex are connected for sure, but not necessarily the same thing, and that every person deserves to be recognized and respected for who they are. The next way we're going to kind of think about and talk about gender is as a social and cultural system. So from the moment we're born, like I said, we're assigned things like male or female, and that comes with a set of scripts. They come with expectations about how we should look, how we should behave, how we speak, how we move about the world. And these expectations shape everything from the clothes we're encouraged to wear, how emotional we can be, which roles are normal for us. And these rules aren't natural and they're not neutral either. They're socially and culturally created, and they're often enforced through things like media, school, religion, family, and policy. Importantly, gender norms change over time and can look different across cultures and communities. What's considered feminine or masculine in one country or even one generation may seem totally different somewhere else. And that shows us that gender isn't fixed, it's fluid, it's responsive, and it's shaped by the world around us. At its core, gender is about how people understand, experience, and express themselves, their sense of who they are in relation to the world. For some, like I said, that might align with the sex they were assigned at birth, and for others, it doesn't. Understanding gender as a social and cultural system helps us challenge narrow definitions and make more space for people to be who they really are without shame or restriction. And part of this social cultural system is this way of knowing gender to be personally experienced, but also socially understood. And what I mean by that is gender is something that we each, kind of experience deeply, even if maybe you haven't thought about it a whole lot before. But it is very personal. It's about how we understand ourselves and how we feel most like us. But gender doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's shaped by the world around us. What, like I said, our culture, our families, the schools, media, and our communities say what gender should look like. This means at the same time, it's personal and social. Like we might have an inner sense of who we are, and that's valid and that's important and it's real. But how people respond to our gender, whether we feel safe expressing our gender, depends a lot on social expectations and norms that are in place. Some people feel at home in the roles and labels that were given to them. Others feel like they have to fight to be understood, to be seen or understood. And for many, gender is something that may change or kind of unfolds over time. So when we say it's personally experienced, socially understood, we mean that like you are the expert in your own gender, but how others see you and how they treat you, including the support you receive or the barriers you face, also shapes how you experience it in your daily life. So that brings us to this, section on gender and expectations. Like I said, when we're born, we're all assigned a letter M or F, and that label follows us throughout life. It dictates how we see ourselves and how other people see us. So I just want to talk or take a minute to let you think about what are some gender expectations that you've heard growing up. Not that you have to believe them or feel like they're true. What are some just like gender expectations or rules that maybe you've heard of implicitly or explicitly? Mhm. Yeah, women are bad drivers. Absolutely. Women are nurturers and love to cook. Yeah. Men aren't allowed to cry. Absolutely. Women are emotional, men are stoic. So a lot of gender stereotypes for specific populations. Yeah, women are carers, for sure. Men can't do caregiver roles. Yeah. It's kind of with the caregiver role, it's kind of like a double-edged sword where it's like one on one side, it's kind of like saddled to women that, they're caretakers. And at the same time, it's kind of like putting this image out that like men are somehow incompetent in being caregivers as a natural role. Probably some are cultural too. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, right? When we look at our culture here and now in 2025, when we look at different countries, when we look back hundreds of years, what gender roles and expectations were look really different. So here are some ones that you might have heard before. Yeah, babysitting his kids as opposed to, you know, caregiving for his kids. Here are some of the ones that I thought that, I've heard lots of times growing up. So like real men don't show emotion, women are caretakers, for when we're talking to kids, right? Like boys like blue, girls like pink, boys play sports, girls are supposed to be nice, girls can't do math. And if any of these or any of the ones in the chat kind of sound familiar, like try to think about it for a sec, like how does this impact students and learning, within these genders or outside? And then as educators, what biases might we have as we're going about our life, especially growing up maybe in a very different time than what's happening right now in our different understandings around gender? And that's the important thing, right? Gender is something is sometimes more as the increasing rhetoric over the last couple of years around trans identities has been happening. There's sometimes this idea that like trans people are really like caught up on gender or like really obsessed with gender. And for me, it's always felt kind of like the opposite to that. We really live in a world that is really, really gender focused and separated out by gender, and lots of rules and expectations that come along with that. And as a trans person myself, that a lot of those things didn't fit for me. But it is something that we're really, really immersed in, like as a whole society, all of us, really all of the time. Going into some more kind of like terms we want to keep in mind as we're going through this presentation, we have gender identity and gender expression. So these are two important but distinct parts of how we experience and how we show our gender. So gender identity, you can see here with like kind of the brain and little colors around it. This is kind of your internal sense of self. It's who you know yourself to be, whether that's a man, a woman, neither, or something else. It's deeply personal and may or may not align with the sex you were assigned at birth. So you can't really tell someone's gender identity just by looking at them. Really, only they know the truth for themselves. Expression is one way that they can share their gender with us. It's a way that we can show or express our gender on the outside. And that could include things like clothing, hairstyle, body language, voice, or kind of how we carry ourselves throughout the world. And everyone expresses gender in different ways. And that expression can shift depending on our culture, the context, especially for trans folks, depending on safety, or depending on how we're feeling at that time. And the key takeaway here is that gender identity is about who you are, and gender expression is how you go about kind of sharing that with the world. They don't always have to align with each other or with social expectations. And no matter how someone expresses their gender, their identity really deserves respect. And so one example I can give you, looking at my own gender identity and expression, I mean, as you can see here, if you're watching, following along on video, I have a masculine presentation. I have facial hair. I wear what is commonly seen as masculine clothing. But my gender identity is actually a bit more kind of complex than that. So I was born female. I was raised as a girl, as a young woman, and I was 25 when I transitioned. So for me, my understanding of my gender really feels not really a man, not really a woman, very much somewhere in between. I identify as genderqueer because I kind of can't there's no kind of a clear path for me on what gender really means to me, but my expression always kind of looks like this. So when I go out in the world, people might, and I'll say rightly, kind of loosely. So see me as a masculine person, might assume my pronouns are he and him because of the way that I express myself, even though my gender identity is not as kind of clear cut as that. So keeping in mind that, again, someone's gender expression isn't going to be the thing that tells you what their gender identity might be. That's going to be something you kind of have to ask questions and get a bit deeper about. I'm going to talk about a few definitions for people who might not be familiar with the gender diverse community, and some of the language that kind of goes along with that. And when we talk about gender, like I said, it's not just a conversation for trans or gender diverse people alone. Everyone has a gender, and that includes cisgender people. And cisgender is a term that describes someone whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So, for example, if you were labeled female at birth and you identify as woman, you're cisgender. Many people have never had to think about this before because when your gender matches what society expects, you often get to move through the world without having your gender questioned or challenged in any way. But gender still affects you. Even cis people are expected to act, speak, dress, and behave in certain ways. Like we said, boys might be told not to cry, girls might be expected to be quiet or to take up less space in the world. And these are gender expectations, and they can feel limiting, unfair, uncomfortable, even if you're cisgender. And naming cisgender is important because it makes visible the fact that everyone is shaped by gender norms, not just trans people. And when we say cisgender, we break the habit of treating that experience as the default or, normal, and everyone else as the exception. It's a small shift, but it creates more space for honest conversation and helps us all kind of reflect on how gender impacts our lives. So even if you're cis, your role in the conversation isn't just to be supportive of trans people, but to reflect on your own gender too. That reflection helps build empathy, solidarity, and a more gender liberated world for all of us. These are some ones that may feel unfamiliar to you if you're not really familiar with the trans community. We're going to look at what we're saying is beyond the binary here, because when most people think about gender, we've often been taught that there are only really two options, man or woman, and this is called the gender binary. A system says you're one or the either. There's no room in between or outside of that. But that binary doesn't really reflect all of the reality of human experience. There are so many different ways that people understand and express their gender, and there always have been. Gender exists on a spectrum, so a wide range of identities, expressions, and experiences that don't neatly fit into just male or female. So the idea that there's only two genders, male and female, is based on a kind of narrow and, for us in our society, a very colonial view of the world. So we're going to take a few minutes to look a little bit closer at some words that kind of reflect the gender diversity among us. So transgender, this is really a broad term for people whose gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. So, for example, someone who is assigned female at birth, who identifies as a man, may describe himself as a trans man. Trans people may be men, women, non-binary, or another gender altogether. Non-binary refers to people whose gender identity doesn't fit neatly into the categories of man or woman. Some non-binary people identify with mixed genders or no gender at all, or maybe a fluid gender. It's an umbrella term, so people might use words like genderqueer, agender, the A meaning without a gender, gender fluid, or other words that might feel right for them. The next big one I want us to kind of keep in mind as we're going through is two-spirit. So this is a term used by some Indigenous people among Turtle Island to describe gender identity, role, sexual orientation, and experiences that exist outside this Western colonial understanding of gender and sexuality. So two-spirit identities are culturally and spiritually rooted and can really vary across different nations. It's important to know that not all Indigenous people, who are trans or queer may not identify as two-spirit, and not all two-spirit people use words like trans and non-binary. And this is important to keep in mind because, like I said, this idea of only two genders for us is really deeply tied to colonization. Many cultures, including Indigenous nations here in what we call Canada, have long recognized two-spirit people and other gender diverse roles. These ways of understanding gender were often suppressed or erased through colonization and systems like the residential school system. So going beyond the binary isn't actually something that's new. It's about remembering, reclaiming knowledge that was already here. And understanding these identities helps us move beyond the limiting assumptions and makes room for people to be fully themselves in their bodies, cultures, and communities. It also means making space for within our language, within our practices and our systems for people without needing to justify or explain themselves. So this might be using inclusive pronouns, offering gender inclusive options on forms, and being open to learning about the many ways people understand and express their gender. So I'd like to just take a second and kind of hear from you folks about what you kind of think the prevalence of gender diversity might be here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So in 2021, the federal census for the first time took note of trans and non-binary people in its census data. And we found that 1 in 300 Canadians over 15 identify as trans or non-binary. So think about it for a second, see if you have any ideas. Where do you think Newfoundland ranks among the other provinces? Do you think we're like the lowest, the highest, somewhere in the middle? Won't get a comment here too. Let them need to look. Just looking at biochemistry to find present for terms. Yeah, absolutely. yeah, cis and trans, these are common prefixes that we use in other ways, right? To mean on the same, cis to being on the same side of, trans mean on the other side of, amongst the highest. Yeah. Yeah, this was something that was really cool for us at TSNL um, to have actual data on. Something that we, could kind of take a gauge of working with the trans community here, but we're also a pretty dispersed population, as Newfoundlanders and particularly as trans folks. So some of the numbers that we've got here, when we rank up against the other provinces and territories, we actually found that Newfoundland had the second highest proportion of trans women youth. I think the youth were between 15 and 24 years old. We also had the third highest proportion of trans men and the fourth highest proportion of non-binary folks. And this is really cool to see. Again, like you said, Newfoundland is a small and geographically dispersed province. We're also not exactly known as being the most progressive province. We're not at the like leading edge of new kind of revolutionary ways of doing things. So this was really cool to see. And what was kind of more uh, hitting home for us was that St. John's actually ranked at the 10th most gender diverse city in Canada. So obviously our population isn't as big as Toronto or Montreal and that, but as a result of a percentage of the population, St. John's actually is considered to be more gender diverse than Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, which are kind of like the queer hubs in Canada. So that was something that was really interesting for us to see, and something that we want people to keep in mind because it's, again, I think it's something that if you're not into the data, if you're not into the community and knowing all of this type of stuff, it might be kind of easy to think like, we're a small province. We probably don't have that many folks here who might be needing this inclusion, who we might need to be considering how their identities show up, especially for young people in education spaces. But we do have a pretty large population. And yeah, this is something that I would say in terms of the province, feeling safe enough to be themselves. I think the St. John's stat is really interesting to look at because I don't know that it's because St. John's is a fantastic hub of trans services and trans inclusion necessarily, but I think it speaks a lot more to the fact that we do have a large gender diverse population and rural isn't always safe. So a lot of folks who are trans who maybe come out in rural end up having to move to St. John's, or some people won't come out until they have moved into the bigger city because there can be so much discrimination, so much stigma, especially in a small community where everyone kind of knows each other and everyone knows each other's business. St. John's, again, I will say is definitely no hub of trans services or, of things to be doing for trans people. But we do know that the population for our province is quite high given what else we know about Newfoundland. Before we get too far into the kind of looking at the UDL principles here, I just wanted to bring this up, especially as many of you are likely educators who may be working with youth. These are just some data on what support can look like and what a big difference it can make. This is an old study now. This is from 2012. This was a Canadian study based out of Ontario from Transpulse, and it looks at the impacts of parental support on youth's mental health. So we can see here, the differences between parental support. The chart here shows the parents who were very supportive in white, the parents who were not at all or somewhat supportive in the pink, and how that related to their kids' mental health. So we see here when parents weren't supportive, almost 75% of the respondents were experiencing depressive symptoms compared to only 23% to those parents who were supportive. And a big thing that we want to kind of like point out here is the suicidality, of course, as well. Consideration of suicide, is about half when parents are supportive, and even more so around suicide attempts. We see only 4% of young folks who had attempted suicide within the past year, compared to 57% of those who found that their parents were not supportive at all. And this study found that strong parental support reduced trans youth's attempted suicide rate by 93%, which is a really impactful statistic, particularly when we're looking at suicide mitigation for young folks. And it's also something that's really important to keep in mind for anyone who might be in children's life. So again, as an educator, as a coach, as a friend, having that one supportive person, that one supportive adult who can kind of help navigate things, who can, be a safe person to be who you are, can make such a difference for trans youth. And so keeping that in mind as you're going throughout, even if parents aren't on board, being a safe adult can go a long way in mitigating those negative mental health outcomes. So now that we got kind of a bit of a primer down around the kind of trans community, we're going to take a minute to go through what life might look like as like a young non-binary student here could be. And after that, we're going to take some time. Again, I hope the chat is going to keep being chatty, and think about what, thinking from a UDL perspective, what could kind of be done to help support this person having a more, impactful and safe educational space to show up. So here we have Casey. Casey is a 13-year-old non-binary student who uses they and them pronouns. Their parents are supportive and they're trying to learn, but school has been more challenging. So at home, Casey mostly feels safe to be themselves, but at school, gender expectations, routines, and environments often make them feel like they don't quite fit in anywhere. They're bright and creative, but lately the grades have dropped. They started skipping activities that they used to enjoy. And we're going to look at a few different points of Casey's week at school and see where kind of some of these pain points are coming up. So on Monday, say, Casey walks into school and immediately notices that the forms handed out for an upcoming field trip are all in the options male or female. So they feel anxious about how to respond without being misgendered in their follow-up communications. Then on Tuesday in gym class, the teams are split by gender. Casey is assigned to the girls' team, even though that doesn't really feel right. So they choose to sit out for part of the class, starting to feel invisible and frustrated. Wednesday, during a group project in science, Casey raises their hand with an idea, but a peer addresses them using the wrong pronoun. So Casey decides to stay quiet for the rest of the session to avoid correction or any further embarrassment. On Thursday, they're going on their field trip, and Casey needs to use the washroom at the museum. In this facility, there's only male and female bathrooms. So Casey feels anxious and ends up avoiding drinking water all morning to delay needing to go. And I will caveat here, this is something that's actually really important and not always talked about in conversations around gender diversity. Having a place to use the bathroom is a very human experience that we've all, I'm sure, had to deal with. And you can think about I don't think that most people don't love going and using public washrooms, but the point is, like, they are there so we can live out the world in a very comfortable way, and not having a bathroom can go to is a big deterrent for a lot of people to not show up in spaces, and it can also lead to further health complications. We know a lot of trans youth who end up kind of just trying to like hold it, end up getting UTIs, bladder infections, and things like this as a result of not having just a safe bathroom to use when they're at school or when they're at the mall. And then we look at Friday. In drama class, students were asked to work together in pairs to create short skits. Many of the suggested scenarios reinforce traditional gender roles, and Casey feels unsure which role to take and stays in the background, missing the chance to fully engage. And so Casey's story isn't unusual. I mean, it is kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are all happening on different days. But it really does highlight how gender norms in school design can shape who feels seen, who participates, and really who thrives in that. So what I'd like us to do is we'll take a couple minutes to think about what we could kind of do. What are some ways we can design for inclusion based on Casey's experience? Like, how could the UDL principles help out here? We can go through them kind of one by one. And again, any thoughts that you have, just pop them into the chat. So again, on Monday, this is when Casey came in and getting handed field trips, but there's only, when they're filling out their information, there's only an option for male or female. And with, not wanting to get misgendered when they do the follow-up communications, Casey really isn't sure how to respond. What are some different things that we could think about for UDL, or, in terms of how we go about designing our forms, our experiences for youth, to help mitigate this? Yeah, some great suggestions here. Use some gender neutral pronouns and names when providing materials for students. Add other options to these forms, right? Example, not binary. And yeah, it might be a better case, use case to have just like gender and you fill in what that means for you. I always notice who does and doesn't provide more than 2 gender options on company forms. Yeah, blank idea it's a great, a blank space is a great idea. Yeah, that's an important point, Anna. 2 options for gender, but also having a place for a name that they might want to be referred to. So this is something that we can kind of keep in mind as we're going through, especially for young people. The name that they were given, the name that's on the birth certificate, on all the forms, might not be a name that they're super comfortable with. And what can we do? How can we kind of create forms to leave that space there to say, like, hey, how would you like to identify? And yeah, that's a good point, Amy. Why does gender need to be included on the form? There's lots of times when we're filling out like sex or gender information that's like, why is this even relevant? If it's on a form for a class field trip, maybe that section doesn't need to be there at all. Absolutely. Yeah, all you folks are right on the right track here, right? Trying to think about, one, how can we, if we have to have the gender on it, how can we open that space up more for, more identities to be expressed here? And then at the same time, kind of really critically thinking of, like, do we need to ask this question at all? Sometimes it is relevant and lots of times it isn't. Yeah, make sure there are gender neutral washrooms in schools, any places that are visited for field trips. Absolutely. What about on Tuesday? So this is, when we're going into school, into gym. I know for myself, at least when I was growing up, back in the 90s, 2000s, splitting the class into boys and girls was actually really common. Even if it wasn't for teams, it was like the boys would go and play this type of activity, they would go and play hockey, and all the girls would play badminton, or something like that, right? Separating people out by their genders, and not just like teams, but also what sports they can kind of partake in. Yeah, that's important. That's a good point, Jordan. Versus including it versus not having it included, like your gender on forms and that. And not putting it on your CV. It can be a really great thing too as well, because we know that through research around how hiring goes, how people recruit at HR, that, race and gender play a huge part in how people kind of evaluate even just like a simple application coming in. Yeah, having co-ed sports teams, not having that separation. Yeah, why gender sports teams? I'm not sure. Um, it was not something that I've ever kind of, yeah, laziness. Yeah, I think it ends up being a quick, for a lot of people, it seems like a quick, obvious way if you have to split a group. Typically there's about half and half on each. Very easy way to kind of do that. But I mean, you could do something where it's like if you were born between December and June, you could be on this team. If you were born between July and November, this team. Having different ways to split kids up outside of gender being the kind of dividing force can be really, really important. And it can also show people what they have in common when we can often see like boys and girls as like two opposing forces, right? And try to get people to come together and to share space and to work as a team over different things that they do have in common. Yeah, it's still done. Playing sports in general is gendered from age 7 and excludes kids from playing sports altogether. Yeah, and there's I would say for the most part here in Newfoundland, I'm sure it's kind of like a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what happens when a student doesn't fit into that gender category. But we know that, of course, now in the States and across Canada now as well, that there are very active efforts by institutions, by governments, to actively prevent trans people, most particularly trans girls and trans women, from being able to participate in sports, sports aligning with their gender. And this is something that like I've been working with trans support now since 2018, and the last few years have been the worst for how the general public and how institutions, how governments are seeing and treating transgender diverse folks. Typically, it's something when I started in like 2018, it's something that we would hope to see just kind of get better over time. And we've seen a big dip down in, the rights, particularly for youth, particularly for trans women and trans girls, in how they're allowed to participate in society. Yeah, when teachers know better, they do better. So getting the message out to avoid gender division will help this thing. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, right? With a lot of these things, especially around gender, it's like some of them just like seem so obvious. Like, of course we'll split them out. Of course, that a lot of girls have much more in common than all of the boys who have a lot more in common. But when we start to think critically about it, especially as adults, we can probably see lots of opportunities throughout our life where like that just wasn't true, right? In terms of how people showed up, in terms of like who they were as a person, that like their gender actually wasn't the determining factor of everything about them. This one can be a little bit hard to think about too, because it involves having to think about not just the trans or non-binary child, but the whole class together. So this is Wednesday during a group project. Casey gets misgendered by a peer, and so decides to stay quiet for the rest of the session and just kind of doesn't want to deal with correcting people or feeling embarrassed. What are some different things we could kind of implement, within the class, within teaching, to, help avoid these types of situations? Yeah, what are the options for children over 7? Yeah, I think it pretty automatically that you join a boys' league or you join a girls' league. Yeah, just using their name is one way to not be using the wrong pronouns for people. And just, I mean, sometimes pronouns can seem a little far off if we haven't been in grade 3 or teaching grade 3 for a while. Pronouns are just, small words, a small set of words that we use in place of a noun, as opposed to saying the noun over and over and over again. It's just a shorter way to be able to recognize who someone's talking about. Yeah, teacher should model and use the correct pronouns. Oh, what's it? It's commentary. Yeah. Model how to ask for someone's pronouns. I do this for my students and work wonders. It's okay to ask. Absolutely. That's something, again, that, try to project it out there, right? That we can't necessarily know someone's pronouns until we ask for them. And sometimes this can feel a little confusing, especially for like younger children, when you're saying like, hey, what's your pronouns? And someone might be like, well, I'm obviously a boy. But just getting them kind of like used to thinking about like what that means and how they go about, defining this for themselves. Is a great way to get everyone kind of thinking about this and making it kind of like a normal ritual. Same as like I think about you can't tell someone's like name by just kind of like looking at them. And if you go to meet someone, and they're like, "Hey, my name is Mike," that like it feels really rude to be like, "You don't look like a Mike to me. I'm just gonna call you Joe instead because you look like a Joe." And that's sometimes how people treat pronouns, right? They're like, "You don't look like what this pronoun means to me, so I'm gonna call you something different instead." Yeah, so it's in here. I find it can be a bit tricky. You don't want to single out Casey by correcting the student that misgendered them, but maybe modeling it for the students consistently, maybe talking about it in general. I think using proper pronouns for folks needs to be part of classroom culture. Yeah, I think this one ends up being kind of like a bit of a tricky one because it's something that like you almost want to have like you want to have done things like proactively, like you say at the beginning of the semester, letting everyone kind of like introduce themselves with pronouns, normalize asking for them, these types of things, so that there's already kind of like a precedent set for it, as opposed to kind of like really bringing that attention in on Casey when like they're already kind of maybe feeling like they just want to be left alone at this point. Seen a resource from the SIS team that is a help sheet for teachers on how to respond when gender is used to bully. Yeah, basically advice on what to say to this for class. Absolutely. And it can be really good too. Like if you do have a trans or non-binary student in your class, having a chat with them like separately, especially if they've just recently come out to you or recently joined your class to say like, hey, how would you like me to handle this when this kind of shows up in class? Is it something that you would like me to take on like addressing fully? Is it something that we need to maybe just have more general conversations about as a kid? For a lot of young folks, and particularly trans and queer folks, right? There's a lot of times a feeling of like not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting that attention on you, just being like, oh, I'll just get through it. I'll just get through high school and things will be better after that. That's it. But that's where, a lot of times a teacher can kind of come in and help, and especially not just in like a punitive way, but in a way of, again, opening these conversations, having people think about it, and really putting that those classroom norms in place right from the beginning. So it's not something where you're kind of like chasing kids around, just kind of like chastising them for things that you're not having bigger conversations about as a class. Yeah, school-wide awareness campaigns about pronouns and gender. Absolutely. This one can be definitely harder for teachers to kind of take on individually, of course. What about facilities that don't match for a non-binary person? So in this case, they were going to the museum, and the museum only had a male and female bathroom. And as a result, Casey kind of just decides to not drink water all morning, just so they can try to avoid having to go to the bathroom. What are some things we can do to kind of keep that in mind as even we're planning our field trips? Yeah, it definitely needs to be more gender neutral bathrooms. Yeah, is that the only place they can do that field trip? Call ahead for booking. Yeah, maybe part of when you're trying to figure out where to go for a field trip is making that call and say like, hey, do you have gender neutral washrooms? And that being a factor that is it kind of works against that particular place as a field trip option. And thinking about depending on what it is you're doing for the curriculum, is there another place that is more inclusive that we could go to and still be able to have the same impact of this lesson? Yeah, being inclusive to all is important. On the 90s show, Ally McNeil, there were only gender neutral bathrooms for everybody, which I don't think was even discussed on the show. Yeah, gender neutral washrooms are a great option. I think all new buildings in the city here in St. John's have to have a gender neutral washroom at the least. But we also know that St. John's is full of old infrastructure and there was no kind of mandate to retrofit everywhere for this. Sometimes that could be a reason why schools or different facilities, different institutions don't have gender neutral washrooms. But it's something to kind of keep in mind, especially if we're looking at making a place that all students can go and feel safe, and also, again, be able to take care of their normal bodily needs, like drinking water and going to the bathroom, and how that can really affect, like, how they show up for that field trip, right? If they're kind of just really anxious about um, having to go to the bathroom, or feeling like they're like thirsty, but they're kind of trying to debate should I drink or not. How engaged can they really be with the material trying to bring them to the fore? Yeah, that's a good point too, right? Check if the facilities are inclusive, and if not, and you still have to go to that location, just giving everyone a heads up, right? Letting people know what to expect. Sometimes that's the best you can do, and I mean that's something I know I try to keep in mind. Doing this work a lot of the time is like we might not be able to give you the scenario that really kind of gives you that sense of belonging, but at the very least we can let you know and be really transparent about what to expect, so you can kind of make your own choices for yourself. It's not the best, but it really does kind of give that attention to that, like, hey, we're thinking about this, and there might not, we can't make the museum build another bathroom or anything like that, but we can give you the heads up so you don't get there and get surprised by the lack of access that you have. And this is the last one. So again, maybe a little bit of a lazy fallback here, right? In drama class, the students were meant to work in pairs to create short little skits, but many of the suggested scenarios reinforce traditional gender roles. And so as a result, Casey kind of just like takes a seat, a back seat, and really doesn't engage fully with this activity. What are some different ways that, like, in classes, in drama classes, when we're talking about especially taking on a role, acting and things like that, that we do give that space for, play, and for, people to kind of really feel that they can get into a role that relates to them and feels comfortable for them. Yeah, use gender neutral names in role playing, being a safe person for Casey right from the start, so they can come and talk to you about all of these things, and you can help identify their needs, make them feel heard, and advocate for changes going forward. Yeah, are the roles given, or the students making them up? Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think in this scenario, it's just kind of like suggested scenarios that people could, put together a skit for. But also, again, maybe thinking about giving a bit more freedom as opposed to giving suggested scenarios. Letting kids kind of have a bit more creativity in making up what those skits might look like themselves. And as a result, that um, doesn't make it just like gender inclusive, but really inclusive, and really gives a lot of agency to the students around all kind of parts of it. I also think acting is something that's really interesting because it's or like drama. Um, a lot of it is taking on a role that isn't you, right? This is, it's about play. And I think this is something that can be really interesting for trans and cis folks in general, to be able to think about playing in a role that, for a cisgender boy, being able to think about, like, how would they play being a girl, or as a girl being able to, how would they be able to act in this role? Um, can also kind of break down some of those norms around, what it means to not just be a boy or a girl, but like when you're talking about acting and experiencing something different and representing something different, giving people a bit more freedom, and the agency to be able to try on different things, not because they're trans or because they want to be trans or anything like that, but like, it's just a very creative way to express themselves. And it can be really different to think about, like, how could they do that in something that seems so far outside of what their maybe normal everyday experiences. Awesome. So thanks everyone for playing this little scenario with me, and lots of great suggestions there. Seems like we got a really great crowd who are able to, again, really actively think about what UDL can look like for trans inclusion. And that's something, again, we want to keep in mind, especially as we look at the numbers here for trans folks in our province. Is they're definitely here. We also know that, like I said, like 1 out of 300 people on the least census identified as trans or non-binary, but those numbers were like 4 to 7 times larger in younger generations. So, we know that there's much more acceptance as at a younger age, many more people that are exploring gender diversity at a younger age. And a lot of that is because they have the relative safety, the language, people who maybe understand them, people they can look up to and learn from. And this is being able to open a lot more conversations for young people about how they want to, go about expressing themselves and defining who they are in the world. So just want to think about these, the kind of like three kind of like principles here for like UDL, and how we can go about using those for like gender inclusive spaces. So again, I'm going to give a couple minutes to think about like what could people what for you to offer, what could people do, thinking about engagement, so that we are kind of building for inclusion around gender diversity. And then I've got a couple of ideas that I thought of as I was building this presentation, that again might kind of match yours as well. I think a lot of these things need to be incorporated into our healthcare system way earlier than they are now. Like, if there are children who know their gender at age 3, support should already be in place, same with mental health issues, detecting neurodivergent conditions, learning disabilities much earlier, just because they're also normal and part of humanity. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about gender and, trans kids, trans folks, or gender non-conforming folks. There's been Again, there's been a lot of growing rhetoric and, anti-trans kind of conversations that have been happening over the last number of years, but a lot of it has been really focused around youth, that children are too young to know their gender, that they're too young to make decisions about themselves. And, a lot of this can come from like a really well-meaning place, a way of saying like, these are big decisions to be thinking about. And, children can't make that, don't know enough at that point in time. But we also don't have that kind of same standard for cisgender kids, right? If you have a child who was assigned female at birth and at 3 years old says I'm a girl, no one kind of like questions that to say like, have you really thought about that? What does that mean for you for the rest of your life and things like that? It's just something that's kind of ingrained and put on them from a very young age. I will say, um, even before babies are born, a lot of the times we find out what their gender is, and kind of as a result, as parents or caregivers or friends of, we start to imagine what their life could be in this particular gender, right? And think about what that could mean for not just, as a baby, but like later down the road. And this sets up again, it's very, very natural to do as humans. We love telling stories. It's how we kind of make sense of the world. But at a certain point, having those, that future that you imagine for your little girl, has to take a backseat to the little girl who's in front of you, and who, as they grow up, start to take agency over their own life and start to make decisions or do things that we didn't plan or see for them happening, right? But at that point as well, right, we're caregivers, we're not living the life for them. So it's something that we want kids to be able to think about who they are and assert themselves in the world. Yeah, and I'd say gender identity equals mental health disorder, but unfortunately not being supported, being able to live authentically can often negatively affect mental health. Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? We know that the community, that there's no disagreeing, no denying that the community has poor mental health outcomes compared to their cisgender, even people who are cisgender, but maybe gay, lesbian, or bi, have, trans people have poor mental health outcomes. But that isn't a result of like being trans. Like being trans doesn't make you depressed. But being trans in a world where people don't accept you who you are, where you're constantly having to fight against institutional and personal kind of dynamics, that's going to make a person depressed. And I think that's true about any kind of discrimination or any kind of lack of belonging or feelings of being unsafe or not understood for who you are, is going to bring a lot of mental anguish to anyone, everyone. During schools, all grades have gender neutral washrooms as well. Official groups need to work with associations, which is what people do gender and try to bring change. Yeah. I think for engagement, this connects really well to foster belonging in the community. I think strategies we chatted about were really impactful. Yeah. Fostering belonging and community in the learning space. And that's the thing, right? Like the you know, feeling like you belong, feeling like you are part of a community, that you're all kind of like here working in the same space together, and that's a shared kind of identity can be so impactful. Absolutely not. That must be painful for the family. And like, yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, something that we always try to talk about when especially when we're talking about youth, is like as a parent of a trans child or a gender diverse child, it can be really scary. It can be really scary. It can be really hard. There can be a lot of emotions that go along with, coming to realization with the child for this. And that's okay. That's totally normal. But we need to make sure that those feelings that parents have and even the pain that they may be feeling doesn't get in the way of that child still being able to live and feel supported. For adults, for parents, that might mean finding a peer support group. There are peer support groups here for parents of trans folks in the province, or going to see a counselor or talking to a good friend about the struggle that you're going through, as opposed to letting that dictate how decisions are made for your child. So these were just some of the things that like I was thinking about. So, using inclusive language, so avoid using gendered phrases like boys and girls, use students or everyone. For really little people, I use friends. Everyone like under the age of 7 is a friend, when I'm talking to like a group. Offer choice and autonomy. So let students choose their partners, the roles that they're playing in, the different topics, have some agency over the topics that reflect their interests and their identities. Of course, representation, which, is a separate thing in itself, but definitely does help engagement. Displaying diverse representation in classroom materials, including trans, non-binary, two-spirit people in examples, in history, in images, and visuals. Collaborative class norms. So again, especially at the beginning of the semester when you have a new class and everyone's kind of coming in and kind of expecting that there's going to be like a bit of like a setting the ground rules kind of a discussion. Doing these collaboratively and having part of it, having a class discussion about it can be a lot more impactful than just like giving the list of rules, especially around things that might seem like new, like, respecting name and pronouns, and gives, again, you can often get a lot more buy-in from the students and actually following through with it. Also integrating like well-being check-ins or kind of quiet reflection space to help students who are facing like identity-based stress can be really important as well. Yeah, ensuring there is representation in our curriculum that is non-trauma based and not just about struggles, but also building agency and pride. Absolutely. I actually here at one, I was newly came out as trans, and I was in a particular course, and we were looking at I don't know, somehow we were looking at reality TV, and it was one of the only non-gender gender studies courses that I did that really talked about trans people. But it was from oh, what's that show? Like one of these like Maury Povich shows, or and it was literally just about a reality show of a trans woman who was getting challenged by the crowd in terms of their gender diversity. And it was something that was like, for me, I was not expecting it at all. And I was like, this is a choice to make in terms of like when we're talking about like reality TV, to have something that is like very clearly like a transphobic incident and not really having a discussion around that, right? Not having a positive representation of life as a trans person. You know, even as a trans person can be really, really hard. So having things around agency, around pride, around just like living a normal life, again, can go a long way. Yeah, what's the difference between non-trauma based and trauma informed? That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think like having trauma informed might be a way that how you go about things. Having conversations around gender diversity that just aren't all like, here are the poor negative mental health stats for trans people. Here's an example of someone being discriminated against for being transgender, or here we're talking about the new laws in Alberta that are against trans people. Not just focusing on like the hard stuff, but also having examples and material that really looks at the full spectrum of life, the positive, as well as the mundane, right? I mean, I would say outside of doing this for my job, I don't think about being trans all that often, except when I'm talking about it. For education for other people, it's not something that I have lots of other very normal parts of my life that I go about. So having examples like that too, of just having a trans person, in an example, and maybe it doesn't even have to do with being trans, right? Maybe it has to do with something else, but it's just giving that representation in ways that aren't just kind of looking at the doom and gloom. Yeah, think of it as always putting people in trauma situations, being bullied, targeted. It's a good way to learn and personally develop, um, different trauma informed, but not where people are always victims, where always in a bad situation. Absolutely. So when I was thinking about like representation here, one of the things I was thinking about was like checking our own gender bias. So kind of like audit materials for binary assumptions or stereotypes. You can update your examples and visuals to show the kind of diversity of genders. Introducing stories, case studies, examples, featuring trans non-binary two-spirit voices. It can also bring it in a little bit more local as well, being able to use like local examples. There have been a number of court cases fought here in Newfoundland and Labrador that have gained rights for trans people across the country. So, there's lots to be talking about. Again, not just in being trans, but the impact that they're having on lives outside of just our province as well. Using gender neutral framing. So when you're exploring, especially topics like family, identity, or health, using gender neutral framing. So, people of all genders, using, if you're talking about sexual health, people with a penis, can be much more inclusive than saying like boys, and assuming that we're talking about it is because they have a penis, again, can kind of give more representation, more ways to kind of like connect with the material without feeling like ostracized or being like the odd one out. Another thing, contact warnings are a controversial topic, I would say, but using context or content warnings, and it's not to say like, hey, don't watch this, but like, or don't show up to this class, but just giving people context before really sensitive discussions can help them come better prepared. To be able to sit through this, like if you're talking about gender identity and you have a trans person in the class, being able to give them kind of like a heads up, and I mean really the whole class, but giving them a heads up so that they know how to best kind of show up to be able to kind of take care of themselves going through. Um, so my friend has a sex teacher in our school in rural Western Labrador. The students started to object to her using proper analytical terms, so she said fine, started saying ridiculous things like pee-pee, and stuff was far worse. So the students realized they preferred the anatomically correct language. Yeah, absolutely, right. And I mean, it's so, I mean, I can't imagine being a sex ed teacher, you know, teaching kids that young about their sexual health and their bodies and their changing bodies and how like awkward that must be so often. But you know, this being anatomically correct means that one, people are talking about what they're really talking about. Instead of saying boys and girls, that's kind of like a shorthand. What we're talking about is, internal reproductive organs and what exactly that means. Again, because it can look really different from person to person. As yeah, people who have a uterus. Again, this is something that like has become like a national debate using a phrase like people who have uterus. We know J.K. Rowling has come out and say like this is ridiculous. Um, I don't identify as a woman. I have a uterus. When people are talking about women's health, I mean, sometimes I can be like, oh, I know as a trans person, this might apply to me too, depending on what we're talking about. But it also means that like when things are put out that like I have to kind of do the work to be like, is this part, does this have reply, relate to me or not, right? And the thing is, like, I would think that, even people who are confused or even against trans identities, um, I would think that most times people wouldn't, when they look at me, assume that I am a woman or that I have a uterus. But at this point in my life, I do. And like when we're talking about like health and taking care of our bodies, like this might be something that I have to know, that my doctors have to know. If I were to go into the emergency room with abdominal cramps, it might be, it's likely really important that the doctors know that I have uterus. That could be the thing that's causing problems, right? Not having that knowledge could mean, big medical mistakes happening, throughout my time there, things being missed. Also including multiple perspectives and reading and media so that identity and diversity becomes like the norm, not the exception. So not only talking about gender diverse people when you're talking about sexual health, but like throughout different points as well. So it doesn't become just like a topic around, again, what are seen as kind of like more controversial topics among school. Yeah, or people who can get pregnant, because there are also cis women that get excluded in conversation as if all women are automatically assumed to be able to get pregnant. Absolutely, for sure. And that's why when we think about like, especially when we think about like, if we only see gender based on like our bodies, like we can start to pick that apart and show how like that's not true for like all of cis women. If we're talking about like having breasts, having breasts makes you a woman. What about people who have had breast cancer and have had their breasts removed? Like, what does that mean to their gender identity if that's such a defining part of being a woman, right? Again, being able to have babies, being able to get pregnant. What happens if you have a infertility? And I mean, I will say from not personal experience, but from what I know, is like this can actually become like even for cis women, right? A really difficult part of trying to reconcile their identity, what they've seen themselves, what the world has told themselves to be as someone who can get pregnant, someone who can be a mother. And if they can't, that this can like really start to impact how they see themselves, within their gender as well, right? Yeah, men can still develop gynecomastia. So like, there are men who can develop what looks to be like typical like women's breasts. And this is something that like, again, they might end up having to get surgery for, right? They might get, what would actually be considered to be like a gender affirming surgery, because it's something that like as a male that like this could be something that's really distressing, because again the assumptions that people make about like having breasts and what that means about your gender. Men can also have breast cancer too, absolutely. And we're talking about action expression. Again, none of these are probably going to seem like terribly radical to you folks, but like offering multiple ways of demonstrating learning. So from writing to video, artwork, or different project formats that allow really authentic expression. Creating gender inclusive facilities and policies. So bathroom access, clothing flexibility, the names on attendance lists all go into creating that environment that we're in. Like we mentioned before, right, letting students choose roles in group or drama work rather than assigning them based on gender. Can be sometimes, again, where teachers who are, again, really well-meaning and trying to do their best can come up against a bit of institutional barriers, right? Having the text systems and the forms reflect chosen names and pronouns. If you go into Power School or something like that and it doesn't have an option for pronouns or doesn't have an option for chosen name, it kind of really limits you as to how you can go about making that, a reality for yourself and for your class. Having the infrastructure, having the actual system set up in a way that allows that freedom can go a long way. And also encouraging really reflective practice, right? Thinking about for yourself, but also getting students to think about like, how do my identities shape who I am, shape how I learn, and use these things to help empower the agency of students to be able to branch out a bit more, to be able to see themselves as being able to kind of like take control of their learning a little bit. Yeah, I read a comment recently that cisgender people get gender affirming surgeries all the time. Absolutely. There are so many gender affirming surgeries and gender affirming health, and gender affirming ways that the world interacts with cis people all of the time, right? Cosmetic surgeries are totally meant to affirm one's gender by molding themselves into the person they envision themselves to be. Absolutely. Even when we're talking about hormone therapy, right? I, as a transmasculine person, I take testosterone, but testosterone wasn't invented for trans people, right? Hormones weren't invented for trans people. These are things that are already part of our healthcare system that are being used for cis folks. A cisgender man who has low testosterone may get testosterone injections. That's also what I get. When we talk about hormones for people assigned female at birth, I know when I was like 14 or 15 years old, being put on a hormonal birth control for acting at the time. And the health risks associated with hormonal birth control are very well known and, have caused a lot of problems around blood clots, right? For a lot of people, it is something to be wary of. Same for a lot of trans women who might be on estrogen-based hormone therapies. When we're talking about a lot of what we're asking for as trans people, it's really nothing different than what is already being done for cis people. It's just maybe, not using the hormones in the way that you're used to as a doctor. Yeah, practically like any form of elective plastic surgery is gender affirming care. Taking Viagra, is a way that like is a healthcare option that for men, that can help them in terms of being gender affirming and, really playing into making the life that they want as a masculine, gender person. And so kind of the key takeaways that I want to be able to like kind of like walk away from today, talking about UDL and how this kind of works for gender diverse folks. Like UDL isn't just about removing barriers to learning, but really, kind of like we talked about, is really making sure every learner feels like they belong. And so when we design for gender diversity, we build classrooms where everyone feels safe to show up, really as themselves. So that's what we wanted, design for belonging, not just access. You can be invited to a party and show up at that party and be kind of like saddled to the corner of the room. And you were invited, but you're not really, given the things you need to feel like you belong. You're not actually being included once you're there. Also thinking about representation, right? Representation matters every day in every detail. So from names on forms to examples in our lessons, these are small things that signal who is welcome and who's important, who's worth talking about. So reviewing your materials, your spaces, and the language with that inclusion in mind. And then also thinking about flexibility as inclusion, right? Offering multiple ways to participate, to express ourselves, and to connect benefits trans and non-binary learners, and really strengthens the learning outcomes for all students, right? Um, Trans people are not the only people who are affected by gender. They're the biggest talking point for it right now. But there are lots of ways that gender norms and gender rules can really limit all students, all people. And at the same time, it can also be really affirming, trans or cisgender, to feel really seen in your gender and to feel really empowered in your gender. And that's absolutely okay and should be something that we prioritize as well. But really getting people to kind of like think about that, students to think about that as they're going through, gives that room for people to show up, whatever their gender diversity might be. And that brings us to the end. I know I kind of like jumped a bunch over a bunch of kind of like different topics to build this up. But in the last like 5 minutes left, does anyone have any questions or comments or anything like that that they want to throw out? Just put this up here too. No, no. Oh my God. I'm so happy that the chat was going. I said to Aiden, like, when I was like, I hope it's a chatty bunch because I've got like some points in there I want people to kind of be thinking about and contributing on. Um, and anytime I do these types of presentations, I always find it so interesting to see how other people think about these things, again, particularly people who aren't part of the trans community, because it is, it's important to think about gender for all of us. And something that I try to really actively do as a trans person within this education is make all spaces inclusive for gender diverse folks. Um, of course, at Transport NL, we work to support the trans community in various different ways. But I really wouldn't want a world where trans people have to go to trans people only for services or, for support or for belonging. But having, everywhere, all spaces, think about these things, I think goes a long way for all trans folks. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Feel free to reach out anytime. That email at the bottom, tsnl.umbrella@gmail. That goes to me. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything like that. We also do like Gender 101 presentations. Like this is a bit of a split between Gender 101 and looking at UDL principles and how that works. But we do have presentations around gender diversity as well. So if there's any questions, if you'd like to learn more, please reach out anytime. And yeah, we'd be happy to help out.
Thank you so much, Logan. I guess I'm just gonna start cluing this up there. A lot of people said their praises and their thanks in the comments, which is excellent. Guys, like Logan got posted here on the thanks slide, all their contact info. They're super duper active all across social media. Their website is super easy to navigate through with lots of different resources and tools. Again, Logan, thank you so much for doing this for us today. So I'd like to pass it over there now to Amy, who's just going to send everybody off with a few final reminders on the next session and other things to look forward to from us moving forward.
Thank you everyone so much for joining us. And of course, I echo Jordan in thanking Logan for taking time to come and share wonderful stories and wonderful content that I think we all enjoyed. You gave us a very clear picture of how common gender diversity here is in Newfoundland and Labrador, which I think surprised many of us, but really sort of grounds us in why it matters so much for us as educators. And reminds us of the role that we have in making sure our classrooms and learning spaces are places where students feel seen, supported, and respected, which were themes all throughout the seminar. And I think walking us through Casey's week at school was also a great way to help us think about how some of the barriers that aren't always visible and how we can better support students in our own teaching. So thank you so much. Some just very quick information I'd like to share to members. Our next seminar next week is going to be facilitated by Stella's Circle. And all of the information for the November seminar is posted on the website. And Stella's Circle facilitators were very generous in inviting us to attend the seminar in person at their site and have ordered a few treats for us and drinks for us. So if you are local to St. John's and would like to join in person, we always offer the seminars hybrid. So if you want to come and join the facilitators and me, we will meet at Stella's Circle, which is at 114 Cabot Street in St. John's. And I do have the location details, the parking details, and accessibility details on the team's registration site. So please consider joining us or of course online. We would love to see you. Also, we are hoping to highlight some member stories on the website over the next few months. So if we have any members who would like to volunteer to maybe highlight some of the UDL focus things they're doing in practice, please let me know. We do have a student who's working with us this semester who would be happy to hear from you and do a short write-up. It doesn't need to be anything huge. All of the strategies we talked about today are all really important and meaningful in the learning and educating that we're doing. So if you're interested in us highlighting you in a blog post, please reply to one of my emails and let me know, and we will be so excited to work on that with you. And we're also looking for facilitators in the new year. So if you are interested in sharing some of your expertise with our members in a 90-minute format such as this, please reach out. We also have volunteers who would be happy to partner with you and help you with slide decks or maybe some of the materials or activities. So if you'd like to host a seminar in the new year, please let me know. And I think that was all I had to remind you of. We're 1 minute over. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, showing up this month, and we look forward to seeing you all again in November.